All right, so now we're at a point where it's time to start talking about making plots in R. So, we've looked at how to describe data, how to choose graphs, a little bit about populations and samples, and now it's time to roll up our sleeves and make some plots. But before we dive in, I have something for you. So I want to talk for a minute about reference cards. So far we've gone through and we've talked about a whole series of different functions with all kinds of different arguments. And as I mentioned, learning R is kind of like learning a new language. It's a lot to keep track of. So what you need to know is that basically nobody keeps all this information in their brain to start out with. If you use R enough, you do start to memorize a number of functions. But when you're first starting out, the thing that's going to be your best friend is a reference card. And so I've actually gone ahead and I've created a reference card for you for the common functions that we use in R. And it's going to look like a lot at first. So what I recommend doing is having a copy of the reference card close at hand, and just making note as we go through and use these different functions in your own words about how and when to use each of these individual functions. So that's one thing before we get started. The other thing we have to talk about before we dive in and work with R is a little bit more about how R is an object-oriented programming language. And so we've talked a little bit about different types of data for thinking about designing experiments and selecting plots. And R knows how to handle different types of data. And so anything that you enter in to R will have a class associated with it. And we can use this class function to check the class of the data that we work with. And the reason why this is really important is because depending on the type of thing that R thinks it's working with, it's going to handle that thing in a specific fashion. So a lot of these classes are very similar to the types of variables we've already talked about, but with a couple of exceptions. So the first class are numeric objects. So these things we've been calling continuous and quantitative variables. So here's a set of different numeric values. R has a separate class for integers, so any kind of count data. So these are all whole numbers. R also knows what a factor is. So that would be one of your explanatory variables, right? And those can be ordinal or categorical or discrete, right? And factors can be ordered or unordered, right? So an ordinal factor is an ordered factor. So good, better, best, large, extra large, grande. And an unordered factor, then there's no order associated with it. Red, green, blue, the Alps, the Rockies, Rainier, things of that nature. R also has special ways to handle dates, and those get really complicated in a hurry, so we're not going to talk about them in this course. But just for general awareness, R can work with dates. And then this last category is pretty important, which are characters, character-based objects. So, for example, if I made a list that contained things like, I accidentally smashed something, I fell asleep, and you notice these are surrounded with quote marks, those are character entries in R. Okay, so a word of caution about character objects in R. In a lot of cases, if you have a series of numbers and then you have a couple of letters, R will default to interpreting that series as being a character object. And in many cases, it's simply the type of object that causes a lot of headaches down the road, because something that's a character object gets handled very, very differently from something that is numeric. So when you are putting your data together to get it into R, you want to avoid having things wind up being a character object in a lot of cases. And you'll also see in the environment window in the upper right, you'll often see some information about how R is interpreting different columns. So if it's interpreting that column as a character, then R will behave very differently than if it interprets a column as a factor or as a bunch of numeric values. So now we've looked at some types of data. Now let's talk a bit about how to actually plot things in R. So how can we plot univariate data? So I showed you this image previously, kind of with a flow chart that shows how you can plot quantitative or discrete univariate data. And now here is a slightly more sophisticated version or busy version of that graphic that now shows you a bit more information. So you can find out the class of an object using the class function. And then you can convert things using functions that are described here. So as.numeric, as.integer, as.ordered, or as.factor. And then the plotting functions we're going to work with here are the ones up top. So hist for a histogram, bar plot for a bar plot, and that's the main thing here at the moment. And there's a bit more information on methods for summarizing univariate data as well. So if the data are normally distributed, the mean and the standard deviation are a good way to summarize the data. If they are not, if they're skewed, then the median and quantiles are better for summarizing the data. Okay, so that's univariate data. So now, how do we plot the bivariate data? We've already looked at one example. This is from the video on describing spread, right? So looking at the spread for mass changes from the anorexia data. So here's our box plot for bivariate data, right? So my explanatory variable, the treatment, is on the x-axis here, and then my response variable, mass change, is on the y-axis here. And I'm going to show you another argument that does the same thing as this top argument. So that's illustrated right here. So what's different between these? Just take a moment and pause this and scrutinize it closely to see what's different. Okay, and so hopefully you noticed that this top portion of the argument in the box plot function is different. So what's happened here is I'm now just referring to mass change and treatment directly, and I've added another argument that says look for these in the anorexia data frame with this data equals anorexia argument. All right, so hopefully by now I've convinced you we've looked at box plots a bit, so they're fairly straightforward to generate. You'll have more opportunities to practice this. So now let's keep moving and we'll take a look at scatter plots. So you need to generate a scatter plot if you've got two numeric axes and each x value can have multiple y values. So let's switch over to RStudio to take a look at scatter plots. All right, for looking at scatter plots in R, we're going to work with some data about some orange trees. So the first thing we're going to do is load the data on orange tree growth. Using the data function, so data orange. And this data set comes with R, so we don't need to install any packages or load any packages. And so let's take a look at this data. And I'm going to introduce another function, the str function, our structure function, which will give us a bit more information. So this actually tells us the class of the data that are present. It's a little cluttered looking in this window here, but it's telling me that I've got tree, which is an ordered factor. age, which is numeric, circumference, which is numeric, and then a couple of other characteristics down here. Another way we can examine just the beginning of the orange data frame is using the head function. So the head function is going to show us just the first 6 rows. So this shows us tree, age, and circumference. And now we know that it's not treating each of these as numeric objects, but instead is treating that as a factor. So here's how to generate a scatter plot of tree age versus tree circumference. So I'm going to start here again with a very simple part of this. So the function we're going to work with is the plot function. And what I want to do is I want circumference on the y-axis. So I want to see how circumference changes with age. And then I'm going to put age on the x-axis. Okay? So before I proceed, I'm just going to check this plot. And okay, so I've got age on the x-axis, circumference on the y-axis, and my code runs. So once I have that, then I can go back in and add some other optional arguments to beautify this. So I like orange still, so I'm going to color the points orange with a call argument. Again, we can check that. And then I'm going to come back to this next argument, PCH. That just changes the shape of the points, makes them solid points. And then I'm going to add in a nicer x and y axis label. So x lab is going to be age in days. And again, we can just double check that. That worked. Then my y-axis label will be circumference. I don't know what my units are here, so I've left that off. And then a question here, what would I need to add to this plot command to change the range for the x-axis? Like what if I wanted the range for the x-axis to be larger? And so to do that, what I can do is I can add in the xlim argument. And this has 2 components. So let's say I want to make the lower limit -10 and the upper limit 2000. So that's adjusted my limits. Okay, so now this is really pretty, and there's some ways you can directly export the plot that you've created, but I'm going to show you one other method for saving a plot. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to wrap this set of commands around my plot function. So what this is going to do is it's going to first open on a PDF, start a PDF, then it's going to write my plot function into that PDF, and then I'm going to close the PDF to save it. So I'm going to do that with a PDF function. First I need to give it a name. So this is from Bio 190. It's my orange plot. And I like to stick the date on things, so I've got 8 of September 2020. And I'm going to tell it how wide I want it, so let's make it 5 inches wide. The default is inches. And I want it to be 5 inches high. So if I run this, nothing really happens in the console or in my plot window. Then I'm going to run the plot command, and then I'm going to stop writing to that PDF file. Okay, so dev off. And okay, so now I haven't talked about where that is writing to in this video, so that's a topic that we'll cover in a different video. But here is where that PDF got generated. So if I open this up, boom, there is my plot of the orange growth data. Okay. Okay, so that is scatter plots in R. So our next plot type are line plots. So for this, let's go back and we're going to annotate this script a little bit. So I'm going to note here that I'm going to generate a scatter plot and also save it in a PDF. And then now I'm going to start working on line plots. Time to start working on line plots. Let's use some data about beavers. So I'm going to load these data. They come with R to begin with. And so again, we can use that head function. Oops. And actually in this case, the beavers dataset loaded two different sets of data. So data for beaver number 1 and data for beaver number 2. So we'll have to look at just beaver number 1. So we've got day, time, the beaver's temperature, and the beaver's activity level. So this is a lot of data, 114 observations. So we're going to look for the time being at just a single day of those observations. So just follow along with me for the moment. So I've got BEAV. We're going to use data from beaver 1. I'm going to use the which function, which beaver $1 day is equal to double equal sign 346. Okay, so that's created a new object here, beav, with 91 observations of 4 variables. Okay, and once again, it's always a good idea to double check what you've made. So I'm going to use the str structure function for beav. Okay, so this says that's a data frame. And there are 91 observations of 4 variables. So I've got day, which is numeric, time, which is numeric, temperature, which is numeric, and activity, which is numeric. So that's great. Those are all in the format I want to work with. Okay, so now let's say I want to look at how a beaver's temperature changes through time. So I'm just going to use that plot function again. And so my y variable is temperature. X variable is time. Okay, so there's that plot. So then that's great, but in this case, I also want to note that these points are connected to each other, right? They're one beaver through time. So I should connect them in the order that they appear. So to do this, I'm going to use a function that's called the points function. And I'm going to specify the same y-axis variable and the same x-axis variable. And in this case, I'm going to add an argument here that's type equals L. Okay, and that type equals L. So the points function doesn't create a new plot. It just adds onto the existing plot. So I can say plot my 2 continuous variables, and then I should add here, add on lines to connect the points together because these are all measurements, the same beaver through time. Okay. Okay, so that's some basics for plotting, and from here what we're going to do is we're going to start getting fancy. We're going to talk a bit more about some of the arguments that can be added into a plot function and about other ways to annotate your plots.